I'm here to introduce Risa Puleo. Risa is an independent curator and critic. Tonight she will be talking about her projects that will be presented at the Contemporary Arts Museum in Houston, Bemis Center for Contemporary Art in Omaha, Charlotte Street Foundation in Kansas City, Art Pace in San Antonio, and the Leslie Lohman Museum in New York City. Puleo has master's degrees from the Center for Curatorial Studies at Bard College and Hunter College's Art History program. She has written for Art in America, Art Papers, Art 21, Asia Art Pacific, Hyperallergenic.com, Modern Painters, and other art publications. She is the inaugural curator in residence at Bemis Center for Contemporary Art in Omaha. Please help me welcome Risa.
Thank you to Cranbrook Sculpture for bringing me here. It's been a really fun time meeting you and doing studio visits. And tonight I'm going to try to do something that I've never done before, which is connect two parts of my practice, one of which I don't talk about very often, or at least not in contemporary art context, which is my practice as an art historian of 16th and 17th century Europe. And specifically, I look at Habsburg collections and interactions with colonial Latin America. That, while centuries away from the contemporary, recently has started to really inform what I'm doing in the contemporary. So I'm going to give you a very brief overview, and then I'm going to move pretty quickly through. I'm going to tell you a little bit about a lot of projects. So this is also the first time I'm doing it publicly, so it'll be interesting for me to see if things that happen in my head also make sense outside of my head. So here we go. These four paintings belong to the same collection, that of Holy Roman Emperor Ferdinand circa 1550, and what is now present-day Innsbruck, Austria, at Ambroise Castle. And one of the questions leading my research was what logic brought these seemingly very different paintings together. Well, in the 16th and 17th century, the word monster was used to describe a range of bodies that didn't fit neatly into categorical binaries based on standards of normativity. These standards were determined by an unspoken visual analysis of bodies, an inventory of shapes, sizes, colors, scales, textures, and governed by measurements of quality and quantity. Sorry, I lost my place. So how much and of what kind? So for instance, giants like Barthélemy Bon and dwarves like Tomel here had too much or too little height on the spectrum of normal stature. The insane lived between different realities, and some people like Vlad the Impaler, also known as Dracula, were inhumanly cruel in a way that made them closer to animals than humans. Others transgress life or death, like Gregor Bocci, when he didn't die from a jousting tournament injury, which he was impaled through the cranium with the spear. And babies born with teeth, or children whose minds would not progress beyond a certain age while their bodies continue to grow, were out of sync with time. Bodies of different skin tone confuse colored standards. Hermaphrodites, a word that today translates to include intersex bodies, transgender bodies, and homosexual practice, had too much genitalia and or sexuality. Conjoined twins had too many heads or arms or legs. But it's not only the ways in which these bodies breach binary categories that make them monstrous, but the ways in which their bodies are staged in images such as these, and the types of looking that they're subjected to. So looking, in some case, amplified to sensationalism and spectacle, and in other ways focused on the minute details of the monster's body, also characterize the phenomenon. In this way, images allowed viewers to look at the monster's body long after she had died, dissect and diagnose them visually. So I'm particularly interested in bodies that were considered excessively hairy. This one's for Monica. bodies that are considered excessively hairy because hair becomes the fulcrum around which one species in the spectrum between human and animal, and gender in the spectrum between human and male is visually discerned. So another place where bodies considered monstrous were represented, I'm going to go back actually, was in proto-gynecological texts, like this page from a book called On Monsters and Marvels by the physician Ambroise Pare. In this way, what I'm talking about when I talk about monsters and monstrosity is about the development of gynecology and obstetrics based on an ancient idea of monstrous births that attempts to explain deformity or difference. So originally understood as an omen, the birth of children with different bodies by the 16th century were instead thought to be the sort of the products of an infinitely creative God. And early modern scientists were trying to figure out what the cause is and how like God's logic worked. So on the other hand, what I'm talking about derives from an equally ancient idea of monstrous races. I'll go there. And the way that early modern people grappled with difference between people of different, what we would say now, race. But in the context of colonial exploration, the idea of monstrous races, as theorized by ancients like Pliny and Herodotus, was used to understand why people in these newly encountered places around the globe look different based on an idea of species. So in the 16th century, the outward appearance of the body governed the social and theological response to the soul. So in other words, if a child is born and that child did not look human or was born dead, would you baptize it? It becomes like a juridical question. Would that child, say one born excessively hairy, get a Christian burial or a Christian baptism? Would you baptize a dog if you thought that a child that was excessively hairy was half dog, half human? Would you baptize it? Would a baby born with two heads attached to one body get one name or two? Would a baby with one head and two bodies? Should a hermaphrodite be christened male or female? What gender's clothes would they wear? And in terms of how this related to indigenous bodies that were brought to Europe, the questions that arose included, is this person another species? Can they be converted to Christianity? Can I, as a European, have sex with an indigenous person? And would the result of that union be a half human, half question mark? So I said that I was going to start in the 16th century and it's going to get contemporary pretty soon. So, but to wrap this up, my art historical research is interested in the places where these three methods meet: museology, the collection of people, gynecology, and colonialism, and have become a really productive sort of matrix for what I'm thinking about right now. So, here's some more women. This is still the gynecology continued. So I'm the first curatorial resident at Bemis Center for Contemporary Art in Omaha, Nebraska, and I would be remiss not to say that my only idea of Omaha before moving there was Omaha steaks. So I just opened my first exhibition, and I've been working on it. I just moved to Omaha in January. And I always have these sorts of questions in my mind, like early modern gynecology, human and animal, and then like Omaha steaks. So when I was putting the exhibition together, this is the last bit of information you need. I'm also from Texas, and I'm constantly following the really embarrassing things that Texas is doing regarding Planned Parenthood and the dismantling of women's rights there. So I've decided to challenge myself during this year at Bemis and think about how can I make an exhibition in light of the current kind of political situation that can be responsive and meaningful without being excessively didactic and falling into the traps of political art and political curating. Like, how can I instead sort of seduce somebody into a conversation that is way more complex than I think sort of, and the word I've been using is digested and chewed upon, and like really presents a deeper sort of argument. So the exhibition Chimeras, which opened in February at Bemis, is my first sort of attempt at doing that. It was really interesting because the week that Chimeras opened, there was this huge announcement about how scientists had fabricated a half pig, half human embryo, and that in the future we could grow these creatures and harvest their organs to like life-saving potential. And then I had this question, which was like, how human does somebody have to, or how human does a half pig, half human embryo need to be before like an ethical flag goes up? Like, is it 1% human? Is it like, and I think they were really keen on saying that it's like 0.01% human pig fetus. But I was like, it's so incredible to me, like, why there's this seemingly like open field of biotechnology in which we're doing things like fabricating real life chimeras, and that this is happening at the same time that women's rights are being kind of like clamped down upon. So this like duality and tension in society is something that I'm hoping to sort of also get into the show. So Chimeras includes work by Kate Clark, a Cranbrook alumna. And I think you can understand based on what I'm saying the show's about, like, the line between human and animal as it comes to reproductive functions. And for me, I had this kind of thought, we'll keep it here. I had this thought that when we talk about like what makes us human, it's always these sort of very elevated terms. So like our capacity for higher cognition, thinking, rationality, self-awareness. But what keeps us in the realm of animal are things like shitting, eating, fucking, sleeping, dying, and birthing. So I had this thought, and this exhibition is a way to try to prove this theory that maybe politicians think that they can regulate women's bodies because reproductive function keeps us in the realm of animal, and like animals, that should be regulated. So trying to prove that theory, I remembered this work by a photographer who lives in Brooklyn named Leo Devon, and it was actually this one here on the your left, I don't know, that kind of is the place that I started from. There's a way that she's kind of, the woman is not present, she's hooked up to all of this apparatus. And for Leah, who made this series after becoming a new mother, she was interested in the ways in which, like, the necessity sometimes of the ways in which we need to rely on technology and things that are quote unquote supposed to be natural. So she invited these new mothers who were all breastfeeding to have their portraits taken using the various like accoutrements of breastfeeding. And there was a way in which this woman, who's kind of like not present as she's strapped to this apparatus, made me think about the ways in which women's bodies, and certainly through breastfeeding, kind of relate to cows, and how we have made a line to this, but there's also certain taboos around breast milk that we also don't talk about. I was also interested in, like, a lot of people have this sort of experience, and yet it's one that's not often imaged, or certainly one that's very, like, private. Okay. And maybe not so allowed to be discussed publicly, so that these photographs are vulnerable and confrontational and showing us this experience. So from there, I went to Miriam Simon, in a project she did called Human Cheese, which she also enlisted the help of breastfeeding mothers and used their milk to make human cheese, which she served at an exhibition in which she turned a gallery into a temporary cheese shop. She called it the Lady Cheese Shop. I was also interested in different kinds of reproduction. So here we have a mechanical reproduction. On the far end, we have the work is by Rashayla Marie Brown, who lives in Chicago. She made this incredible portrait in which she dresses in multiple layers of leopard print as a commentary on passing. Passing for a leopard is part of the title in this very epic, beautiful poem that she's written for the title. And what happened, because it's such an incredible photograph, is that it went viral. So there's this way that the photograph got reprinted here on Instagram. Well, first in the middle, you can see it reprinted on the sort of Chicago weekly newspaper. Then that gets reposted on Instagram in relationship to like Cookie. And then I began to think about the way that we use the word viral to explain what images do in the world and how that's sort of like another way of having an animal or like a biological sort of metaphor. So what I did was ask Rashayla to compile the entire archive of the way that this image lives in the world, both as print matter and digital matter, and bring it back together. And then I worked with a collaborative duo, Lucie, Strecker, and Klaus Spiess, who are taking reproduction into another way, and that's genetic cloning. This at the top is an image of, we all know Joseph Beuys, and in the 70s, Joseph Beuys archived the blood of 50 rabbits. For Beuys, the rabbit was a metaphor for transgressing life and death and his shamanistic, like kind of holistic healing spectrum. So Lucie and Klaus unarchived the blood, took it to a geneticist and had that blood cloned, and then impregnated the DNA of the rabbit into a yeast cell that's on the bottom image. These two things are displayed in concert with this drawing that shows a relationship between biology and capitalism. And then what they did was the original work is hooked up to a cooling machine in which the life of the cells is determined by the rise and fall of Joseph Beuys, the prices of cattle and Joseph Beuys artwork on the open market. So that's Chimeras. This next show is actually traveling. I workshopped it last year at a place called Roots and Culture in Chicago, and now it's going to go to Charlotte Street Foundation in Kansas City and also to another place called Soladias in San Antonio, Texas. Disability certainly plays into ideas of what was considered monstrous in the 16th century, and this is an attempt to rethink the work of a few artists that I'm in conversation with and think about disability as a different kind of choreography. So the method here is choreography and thinking about how disability lets us move differently through the world and specifically moving differently around institutions that are disabling. So the exhibition is mostly of instructions, scores, and provocations to an audience member to enact. There's also sculpture, which I'll get to. So this is a series of 3 scores by Constantina, Zavitsanos, and Park McArthur, both of whom live in New York City. And each one is a set of instructions for how to accompany somebody who lives in a wheelchair in the world. Constantina also made this sculpture, which is a set of bathroom access bars, like the ones that you use in a bathroom, toilet, or shower, but she's arranged them here like a Donald Judd stack. And this work was made in response to having an invitation to have a residency at a location that was incredibly difficult to access, especially for one with mobility issues. So on one hand, you're being given an opportunity. On the other hand, you can't actually take advantage of it because it's inaccessible to you physically. So she arranged this almost as like a Donald Judd stack and transforms the stack into a sort of ladder of success in which you can kind of like climb up, but also acknowledging the ways in which we need support systems to do that. I love this work by Harriet Sanderson. She recently passed away, and she's from Seattle, in which this chair is precariously balanced on 4 canes. Sarah Sudoff is a Houston-based photographer, and for this series, she's done many projects with different hospitals, but this one she went to the morgue, and she sifted through the cremains at the crematorium and found all of the mobility implants that don't burn after someone's passed. So these are hip implants and leg implants. And this is a performance by an artist named Carmen Papalia, who's visually impaired. And in this performance, he used a 16-foot walking cane, which I really like how he talks about it. 16 feet is about the kind of space you need to keep somebody from asking you if you need help. Okay, next project. My Vicious Throbbing Heart. It's opening sometime in September at a space called Franklin Streetworks in Stamford, Connecticut, and thinking about abstraction, I think hopefully in a new way, an idea of like coming into and out of being. So this is a painting by Kelty Ferris. And I was thinking about, we hear a lot about like zombie painting, the death of painting. Painting is always dying. But I was thinking about what could a Frankenstein painting kind of be, like a monstrous painting, a painting that's trying to become. And I started looking for paintings that had like a very like vicious, like viscous, luscious materiality that were kind of like, that felt bodily in some way, and then enacted aspects of like palpitation or dance or flutter or like any sort of beating or almost like trying to come off the canvas through an abstract dimensionality. So work by Anna Betbies, who paints on sheepskin, for instance, often dyed or burned or manipulated heavily. So alternative sorts of canvases, and then also epic scale, as you can see. Or Laurel Sparks, also based in Brooklyn. Laurel uses very complex, like alchemical, magical divination systems to determine the forms of her paintings. Okay, so there's Omaha. I moved to Omaha. I moved there 3 months ago. And part of what I'm there to do at Omaha is make exhibitions. So I proposed before I got there, because I was watching heavily what was happening in Standing Rock, and I really wanted to go to Standing Rock when I was in Omaha. I proposed as a sort of framework for looking at the region that I was going to use the path of the monarch butterfly. So the monarch travels from Canada, like kind of above the lakes, through Wisconsin, Minneapolis. It goes through the plains in Omaha. It goes through Texas, and ultimately lands in Michoacan, Mexico. So I was going to use the path of the monarch butterfly as a sort of framework for looking at how people also historically have moved along that same path. So I'm pulling together an exhibition of indigenous, immigrant, or otherwise brown artists from the region, because I also thought that I've only lived in Omaha 3 months, but it's really radically different than the image that I think is portrayed of what the Midwest is right now. And Omaha, in my experience, has been actually pretty international. And I was talking to an artist who's now based in Chicago, and his family is historically from a town in Mexico. And he was telling me how when people from his town immigrate to the United States, they land in Lincoln, Nebraska, of all places. And I was thinking about it, and he was saying, like, somehow along the way, Lincoln, Nebraska became this hub. And I started thinking about, like, how there are places in the United States, and certainly around this corridor, because of, like, long histories of migrant farming needs, and then also the cattle industry and the meatpacking industry, how there are places that have just become like milkweed patches. So the monarch butterfly travels from milkweed patch to milkweed patch, like on its way back and forth from Mexico to Canada, and that maybe there are places that function in that same way for people too. So this is a project by Margarita Cabrera. It's actually an older piece for her. She made it at a residency in Art Pace. And she's somebody who's really interested in recuperating craft traditions from Mexico that are almost lost. So she uses, in this case, copper pennies to make this sort of hoard of copper butterflies. And so this work has been sort of an image for me in my mind as I've been like formulating this exhibition. This is a work by Nancy Friedmann-Sanchez, who is originally from Bogota, Colombia, and then went to New York, and then is married to an artist also who's originally from Lincoln. So now they spend their time between Lincoln and New York. And Nancy is looking at 17th century Spanish painting, but specifically paintings like this have their like dark, in the 17th century, have their dark, like black inky background because Spain was using Latin America as a detour for moving objects from China. So she's thinking about like lacquerware that's coming through from China through Latin America on its way to Europe, and then also decorated in this sort of very Spanish 17th century sort of still lifestyle. This painting is massive. It's like 20 feet. And she's painting on Tyvek, which I also think is really interesting because she's thinking about, it's a lightweight material, it's an enormous painting that she can essentially roll up. So she's thinking about issues of mobility when she's making it. The show has become really about materials. So for instance, there's this artist from Tulsa who's making baskets, and then Harold Mendez also using, in the 17th century, the reason that Spanish painting in the 16th and 17th century has that deep, luscious redness is because there's a Native American, or there's a bug called the cochineal bug that's indigenous to the Americas. So they were harvesting this bug and crushing it to produce this like deep red that we associate with like the Baroque in Spain. So Harold Mendez here is using that bug as a pigment, thinking about like this sort of material history. Then I'm also interested in like other traditional crafts, like basket weaving is coming up. There's also beadwork that's coming up in this exhibition. Ivan Lozano is an artist based in Chicago. He is an American born in Guadalajara, moved to Texas, and now is in Chicago. And he has been transferring image to tape in these strips and then weaving them into abstract patterns. So for the exhibition, he's going to be creating a weaving based out of like kind of cliche images of Mexican sunsets with some of the more violent images that he's experienced in his life, like shootings in Guadalajara. This is an artist originally from El Paso, but went to school in Texas, now lives in New York. His name is Carlos Rosales Silva. And he's also interested in the sort of the aesthetics and the materiality of, Mexican-American culture. So there's references here to stucco housing paint. And I believe this white one is called New Mexico Flea Market. Dyani Whitehawk is an artist who's living in Minneapolis. Some of these paintings include beadwork and also are kind of touching upon the way that modernism appropriates indigenous arts, but in a way that acknowledges that indigeneity a little more directly. And Josh Rios and Anthony Romero often collaborate together on performances. This is documentation of a performance in which Anthony here is reading Robert Smithson's writings about Mexico, and when you revisit them, they talk a lot about like the sort of the violence that's inherent to the Mexican soil and kind of brings out a lot of Smithson's colonial impulses, while Josh is performing Waiting for Godot as if he was in an immigrant detention center along the U.S. border. Okay. So I'm also working on another exhibition with two collaborators, Noam Parnas and Daniel Sanders, for the Leslie Lohman Museum of Gay and Lesbian Art in New York City, and it's called Haptic Tactics, and it's thinking about, again, materiality, and trying to expand what our conceptions of queerness are beyond the specificity of same-sex object choice to engage the sort of eroticism of inanimate objects. So emphasizing touch, smell, sound, and taste. It's an attempt to sort of de-pathologize fetish for shapes, colors, and numbers and textures, and other objects that kind of might incite pleasure. And a lot of these works imagine a sensuous engagement with the viewer through the artist's engagement with sort of the sensual qualities of materials. So Jessie Herod, the more colorful one, is an artist who uses craft traditions. In this case, in this image, she's evoking like the history of macrame and fiber to make these abstract paintings, which are actually not so abstract when you continue to look at them. They kind of like unfold into vaginas. And like it's almost this place where like macrame meets BDSM and like tying up. There's this undercurrent in the show for sure about like reimagining minimalism as sort of like BDSM props and furniture. Carrie Yamaoka also lives in New York. These are paintings that are produced through like a very like flexible, pliable sort of material, often like inflected with silver, and then she does things like rub them against walls to sort of imprint them with the space, so that's like the painting engaging the space in a tactile, haptic way. I think this is the last project I'm going to talk about. So this is the project I've been working on the longest, and it's 4 years in the making, and it will open at the Contemporary Arts Museum in Houston in 2018. So it's an exhibition that is bringing together artists across the country who are confronting the American justice system in their artwork. And I would also say at this point, all of those political shows that I was talking about, like Chimeras and Monarchs and the Care show, they're kind of like a foil for me to make this show. Like, I feel like I'm using those shows as sort of experiments for getting this show, for dealing with that question of didacticism that I'm kind of so afraid of. But in thinking about how to make an exhibition about the American justice system and also more specifically prisons, it became really important to me to not participate in the sort of spectacle of the trend that is currently, there's a lot of interest in prisons right now. And I didn't want to make an exhibition. There's a way you can like make an exhibition where like prisons is kind of like can be substituted for like abstract painting, and I didn't want to do that. I wanted it to be like methodologically sound and also be a contribution instead of just replicating. So I went back to my 16th century work and began to think about how the early modern museum was founded on these collections of people and how the prison essentially was a contemporary collection of people. So how can we think about the prison museologically? And so Coco Fusco and Guillermo Gomez Peña's seminal work, Couple in a Cage, is where the exhibition starts and allows me to kind of tackle that question. So in the performance, if you remember it, Coco and Guillermo pretend or are performing as the inhabitants of a newly discovered island, and they're replicating the aesthetics and methods of the human zoos of the 19th century. So I saw the human zoo as this place where like prisons, museums, and zoos overlap. And so the exhibition moves forward from there to work by Glenn Ligon. This is his Runaway series, which I then resaw as like introducing the criminal, and then jumps ahead in time to someone like Dred Scott, who worked with youth in Harlem, Queens, and Brooklyn to create a series of fictional wanted posters on the stereotypical idea of who a criminal was. I think that is all. That was a little bit about a lot of things, so I'm going to turn it over to questions.